crime was caused by civilians taking revenge. Mr. Hayden testified that while he considered the information provided by Mr. Passage, he ruled out civilians as perpetrators of crimes in the area. He did so despite having no information or investigation about how many civilians remained in the area after the Serb evacuation. How many civilians came back? This information was absolutely required before drawing his conclusion, as the presiding judge directed to Mr. Hayden at page 10,634, lines 11 to 12. The presiding judge asked Mr. Hayden, "I'm not asking you what you saw," and referring to the lack considering this information. The presiding judge says, "I'm asking you whether you agree with me that this is a serious flaw in the reasoning." Mr. Hayden rejected that. Suffice it to say that the prosecution has rejected the same matter. They've done the same exact thing. They failed to ask, like Mr. Hayden, the following questions, simple questions, before contending that the only reasonable interpretation of the evidence was that HV members, under the effective control of General Gotovine, were the primary cause of crime. Did any of these crimes occur before Operation Storm? Were any civilians returned? Had they returned to the area? When did they return? And how many? Were there civilian police in the area and military police? Did any of these categories of other people contribute to the problem? To the extent that people in uniform were observed, were they actual soldiers, or do they have access to camouflage information? Were these people acting individually or with one another, or are they acting in an organized fashion as a unit with a command and control structure? This is a fatal flaw in the presentation that is made by the prosecution. If we turn to paragraph 479 of the prosecution's briefs, they argue that the vast majority of these crimes were carried out by HV soldiers, consistent with what Mr. Generala said yesterday, that most of these crimes. Well, what does that mean? The vast majority of them were made. Most of these crimes were committed by the HV. The prosecution conceded yesterday, for the first time at page 57, lines 13 through 15, that, quote, civilians were involved in the commission of crimes. Okay. How many instances were they involved with? And when? And where? The prosecution never tells us. Turning back to paragraph 479 of the prosecution's brief, they note that a vast majority of these crimes were committed by the HV. They make several assumptions. They note that there was no mass return of Croat DPs until August 15th. Now let's look at the logic of that. There was no mass return. How many civilians or IDPs came back? How many civilians were in the area? Why would a mass return be required for crimes to be committed to civilians? How many returnees or criminals need to infiltrate the area before the prosecution would consider the possibility that they have committed a crime? In pegging this return to August 15th, what they are trying to say is that there are no civilians coming in prior to the 15th, ergo, these are all HV soldiers, and General Gotovine must be responsible. I hasten to correct their error in that regard. As shown by page 6 of Exhibit P352, page 2, page 6 of P352, page 2 of D277, and page 1 of P805, and we detail this in our brief in paragraphs 482 and 498. Civilians were coming back to this liberated area as early as the 6th of August. Internationals on various different levels report people coming back as of that date. This is essentially ignored by the prosecution. Next, in that same allegation, they note that the military, and I'm talking about in their paragraph of 479, that the military had full control of the area and checkpoints were established to prevent civilians from entering. Well, we detail this in paragraphs 464 to 469. But their own evidence contradicts that allegation. Look at the citations, as Mr. Teager invited us to do, for that statement. It's Mr. Morich and Mr. Sipsey, and both say that restriction of movement in the area was done by civilians, the civilian police, not by the military police. Finally, the implicit reference in there that with checkpoints this area is going to be safeguarded and sealed off is simply preposterous. As we see in paragraph 517 of the Gotovine brief, criminals like Village will get around checkpoints easily because they knew the area. Mr. Golovich noted that it was impossible to have checkpoints close off this area. General Cross, who had experience of this in many different theaters, said checkpoints in an area such as this would be impossible to foreclose people from getting in. In fact, there are even reports in this that we can detail where gunmos, when faced with checkpoints, knew enough about the area to get around it. There is simply no basis, in fact, for this allegation that somehow checkpoints foreclosed people from coming into the area. Finally, of course, what the prosecution tacitly agreed to was that after 15th there was a combination of civilians in there and that they were participating in this crime. But their answer to that is, and they cite the chamber to paragraph 195 of the Markača appeal, was it really doesn't make a difference because they're part and parcel of the working with the army and they're all guilty, and Markača says so. Simply not true. Completely inaccurate cite which Your Honors directed us to. First of all, if we look at that in paragraph 195, the analysis was that the trial chamber found these individuals that were committing these crimes were paramilitaries working in conjunction with the JNA and could be directly tied to the accused, Mr. Markača, as part of his JCE liability. Such facts were never demonstrated here. The evidence that we have is this criminal activity was disorganized, took place at various times and places with people in uniforms operating in conjunction with civilians. The more appropriate analysis, I submit to Your Honors, is in paragraphs 191 to 193 and 197 to 200, where the Markača appeal chamber discusses this matter. And in paragraph 200, the appeals chamber notes as follows. The appeals chamber concludes that the trial chamber erred in establishing a link between Markača and the perpetrators of these crimes. In particular, the appeal chamber finds that the origin of the armed men and their affiliation remains uncertain. Without any further elaboration on the affiliation of these armed men, no reasonable trier of fact could have held that the only reasonable conclusion in the circumstance was that these crimes could be imputed to a member of the JCE. Now I add, Your Honors, that the appeals chamber drew this conclusion despite the fact that the armed men were wearing camouflage and olive-green uniforms at the time the crimes were committed. We implore the chamber to use this analysis when looking at the particular crimes that were levied by the prosecution, because they have not developed or made any connection by people in camouflage uniform, that people committing crimes, and have tied this back to General Gotovine as part of his chain of command and as effective chain of command. Just briefly going through this restriction of movements matter that was set forth on page 148 of the prosecution's brief. Of course, the inference from this is that because there's a restriction of movement, that crimes were allowed to occur. This is mistaken on many different levels. First, of course, logically, one would have to say that when restrictions of movement were in place, that crimes took place, and when restriction of movements didn't take place, well, crimes weren't taking place. Well, of course, there's no evidence in the record to support that at all. If we look at the various aspects of for instance, Kistanya, is it the prosecution's position based on P-148 that HV members were only involved in criminal behavior in Kistanya on the 11th of August and not before that and not after that? Absent the prosecution taking that position, the juxtaposition of restriction of movement on the 11th of August with allegations of crime is irrelevant. The second flaw in the argument is that it was done to actually, any restriction of movement was done to cover up crimes. And we turn the chamber to paragraphs 394 to 397 in our brief where we talk about that. But most instructive is one about Bankovats. There are two entries for Bankovats on the 7th of August and the 21st of August. If we look what the entries are, any restriction of movement was not an attempt to cover up anything at all. What is cited for that restriction of movement is P-112. That's in footnote 1312. There, the unmost witness was not a cover-up or a tolerance for looting, but they report that MP searching civilian vehicles driven by what appear to be HV members and seizing items that appear to be looted. This does not support a claim of criminal activity put in place because of restriction of movement. Furthermore, as demonstrated by P-1211, although problems did arise when HV members from the Bankovats area stayed in town drinking after its liberation, the commander of OG Zadar by August 8th issued an order forbidding HV members from entering Bankovats, and the town was put under control of the MP to prevent entry by HV and civilians. Lastly, when we look at many of these restrictions of movement can be done for many different reasons. A restriction of movement that's done in Bosnia certainly was not done for anything other than restricting movement during a combat situation. Restriction of movements were done by civilian police and even military police, people that are not under the chain of command of General Gotovine. What the prosecution has failed to establish through this chart is that there is some correlation between a restriction of movement and crime. They simply throw out an issue of restriction of movement and maintain that some crime was taking place in the area and that there's some correlation between the both. I think what we have from the Martich appeals judgment is that that type of analysis does not suffice. Now I would like to lastly turn to the murder count situation as laid out by Generali.
Thank you. You are aware that there are 30 minutes remaining.
My timing, Judge, takes us to...
And until 12:03 is how we've broken it up.
12:33.
Oh, 12:03.
12:03.
Yeah. We started at approximately 9 until 10:30, and let's not count for the minutes. Otherwise we'll be short of 10 minutes for the three defense teams and have to restart tomorrow. So therefore, we resumed at 5 minutes to 11, even if it has been 4 minutes to 11, and you took another 30 minutes. So we are now at approximately 120 minutes. Please proceed.
Yes, Mr. President. I will try to conclude quite promptly. And I think that when we look about the individual murder counts, we have detailed where we are in murder counts and have gone through it with some degree of specificity as much as possible. Suffice it to say, the murder counts suffer from much of the same or all of the same flaws as the damage to property counts, i.e. what the prosecution has done is they have attempted in many instances to put soldiers in the area. And I hasten to add that was only in 64 instances out of 292. And then want to draw the conclusion that because soldiers were